On a February night in 1897, the windows of the grandest hotel in New York were boarded shut, and hundreds of policemen ringed the doors. Inside, Cornelia Bradley Martin stood dressed as a beheaded queen, in a ballroom rebuilt as the Palace of Versailles, while a hungry country pressed against the planks outside. Within 2 years, she would leave America for good. She was not the only one. One queen was dethroned by a younger rival and spent her last nights coming down a staircase in full diamonds to greet friends who had been dead for years. One ruled all of Newport on nothing but a cruel joke and outlived the room that laughed at it. One built the largest ballroom in America and ended alone inside it, seating and greeting a party that did not exist. They were the women who ruled New York, and every one of them learned the same thing too late. A throne made of other people's applause is the one throne that cannot be defended, and applause, once it stops, can never be bought back. If you have ever wondered what it truly costs to rule a room, and what becomes of a woman when the room decides it is finished with her, subscribe and stay with me. What these 4 queens paid was never printed on the invitations, and it never showed in the photographs. Chapter 1. The throne was made of applause. In a country founded on the promise that it would have no kings, someone still had to decide who mattered, and for the better part of 2 generations that decision belonged to a handful of women standing in a handful of rooms. There was no crown to inherit and no title to confer. There was only the invitation, and the ballroom it admitted you to, and the woman at the top of the stairs who decided whether your name went onto the list or was quietly left in the dark. That was the whole of it. And because it looked like nothing, like a matter of parties and gowns and place cards, it is easy to miss how much power it really was, and how strange a thing that power was made of. Consider what these women actually controlled. They did not own the railroads, or the mines, or the banks. Their husbands and fathers did that, and were called titans for it. What the great hostesses owned was something the titans could not buy and could not counterfeit, which was the right to say who existed. In the America of the 1870s and 80s and 90s, a family could have $10 million and a mansion on Fifth Avenue and still be nobody, still be shut out of every drawing room that counted, because a woman with an older name had decided they were not to be received. Money was the price of admission to the game. It was never the game itself. The game was recognition, and recognition was handed out, one invitation at a time, by 4 or 5 women whose approval was the only currency that could not be minted. And here is the thing about that currency, the thing this whole story turns on. It existed only in other people's minds. A fortune in gold is yours, whether or not anyone approves of you. It sits in a vault, indifferent to opinion, and it is still there in the morning. But a throne built of deference is yours only for as long as the crowd keeps agreeing to kneel. It has no vault. It cannot be locked away or insured or left to a grateful heir. The moment enough people decide they will no longer look up to you, there is simply nothing there. And there was never anything there but the looking. Social power was, in that exact sense, the most fragile fortune of the entire Gilded Age. The men who counted their millions never fully understood this. The women who lived and died by the guest list understood it in their bones, because they spent every waking hour defending a thing that could not be held. And defending it was labor, real and exhausting, though it never looked like work. To keep a throne of this kind, a woman had to remember every slight and every debt, to know precisely who had called on whom and who had failed to read a ballroom the way a general reads a battlefield, to sense the exact moment a rival gained a step, and to answer it before the season turned. Alva Vanderbilt, who spent her life at this war, once said that she knew of no profession, art, or work more taxing on the nerves and the mind than being a leader of society. She meant it. It was a full-time reign over a kingdom that could dissolve if she looked away, and the strain of it, the endless vigilance over a thing made of nothing but opinion, wore these women down in ways the ledgers of their husbands never recorded. The room where all of it happened, the room that measured the whole of a person's worth, was the ballroom. Think of the ballroom as the unit of power in this world, the way an acre is the unit of land. Society was not an idea or a feeling. It was, quite literally, the number of people who could fit inside one. The most famous number in American social history, the 400, was not a fortune and not a bloodline. It was, by the story everyone told, the seating capacity of a single drawing room on Fifth Avenue. You were either inside those walls or you were not, and inside those walls was everything. This is a story about 4 women who owned those rooms, and about what the rooms did to them at the end. Because the ballroom is a stranger thing than it looks. It is where you are crowned, and it is also, if you live long enough and fall far enough, where you are forgotten. The same 4 walls that measure your reign will measure your ruin. And for 2 of the women in this film, the ballroom did something more terrible still. It stayed exactly as it had always been, gilded and waiting and lit for a party long after everyone had gone, and they went on giving the ball inside it anyway, to a room full of the dead. That is where this ends. It begins with a woman who spent a fortune to fill a ballroom for a single night and lost her entire country for it. Chapter 2. 400 names in one ballroom. The number that ruled American high society was not a sum of money or a line of descent. It was the seating capacity of a room. To understand how 4 women could rise so high and fall so completely, the first thing to grasp is how absurdly small and how absolutely real the world at the top actually was. In the decades after the Civil War, more money was made in America, and made faster than any people on Earth had ever made before. Railroads, copper, silver, steel, oil, dime stores, all of it throwing up fortunes on a scale the old world had never imagined. And with the new money came a new anxiety, because money alone did not tell anyone where they stood. A man might be worth $20 million and have no idea whether he was a gentleman, because there was no herald's office to rule on it, and no king to knight him. Into that vacuum stepped the hostesses, and above all, one woman, Caroline Astor, who will have her own reckoning later in this film. She and her lieutenant, a southern dandy named Ward McAllister, built a machine for manufacturing rank out of nothing but ritual, and it worked because everyone agreed to believe in it. The machine ran on the calling card and the invitation, and it is worth understanding just how the ritual worked, because the whole cruel comedy of the age lived inside it. A newcomer who wished to be received would leave her card at the door of an established lady, a small, stiff rectangle of pasteboard with her name upon it, and then she would wait. She might wait weeks. She might wait years. She might wait forever. If the card was answered, if the great lady returned a card of her own, the newcomer had been admitted to the human race, and every door in the city opened at once. If the card was not answered, the message was delivered in perfect silence, and it was final. There was no appeal, no explanation, no second hearing. A woman could be worth millions and find that her card had gone unanswered for a decade, and understand that she had been told, without a single word ever being spoken, that she did not exist. McAllister organized the men into a society of patriarchs, 25 gentlemen, who each controlled a fixed number of invitations to a series of subscription balls, and those balls became the gate through which one passed into society or was turned away. He gave the whole apparatus its immortal number when he told a newspaper in 1888 that there were only about 400 people in fashionable New York society, and that if you went beyond that number, you struck people who were not at ease in a ballroom. The line was cruel and the arithmetic was invented, but it stuck because it named a truth everyone already lived by. There was room at the top for only so many, and the woman who controlled the room controlled the country's idea of itself. Underneath the ritual ran a war, and the war was between old money and new. The old families, the Knickerbocker Dutch and the early merchants, had been rich long enough to have forgotten how they got that way, and they treated that head start as though it were nobility. The new fortunes, the Vanderbilts with their railroads and the Western families with their silver, had more money and less standing, and they wanted in. The whole drama of Gilded Age society is the story of that pressure. The new money hammering at the gate, the old money holding it shut, and the gate, in the end, giving way. Every woman in this film is somewhere in that war. One was new money pretending to be old. One had almost no money at all. One was the very keeper of the gate. And one carried a silver fortune so new the ink was barely dry, and spent it building the largest ballroom in Newport to prove she belonged. The war had a marriage market attached to it, and the market ran a brisk and profitable trade in daughters. By the 1880s, a settled exchange had grown up between the new American fortunes and the old European titles, and everyone involved understood it as a transaction, because it was one. On one side stood families with more money than name, hungry for the legitimacy a coronet conferred. On the other stood counts and earls and princes with ancient blood and empty treasuries, bleeding money from crumbling estates. The daughter was the instrument that settled the trade. She carried the dollars up the aisle in America, and the title came back down it, and a dowry that could have built a hospital changed hands as casually as a dinner reservation. The newspapers had a name for these girls: dollar princesses. It sounded like a fairy tale. It was a commodities exchange, and the commodity wore white. Remember the trade, because the first woman in this film sold her own daughter into it and thought it a triumph. And beneath all of it, holding the whole glittering structure up, was an invisible army. Every ball and every dinner and every perfectly kept house ran on the labor of servants without number, the maids and footmen and cooks and coachmen and secretaries and ladies' maids who lived below the stairs and were, for the most part, poorly paid and quickly forgotten. A single great cottage in Newport might keep a staff of dozens through a single summer. The whole spectacle of the age, the 28-course suppers and the ballrooms lit until dawn, rested on hands that were cheap and plentiful, and no one at the top ever imagined those hands might one day be somewhere else. But they would be. When the servants began to leave, for the factories and the cities and the better wages of a new century, the machine that made the rains possible would begin to grind to a halt, and the palaces would become impossible to run. Remember the servants, because their quiet departure is part of how every one of these worlds came to its end. Because society had a second capital, and it was by the sea. In the summers, the whole apparatus moved north to Newport, Rhode Island, to a strip of coast where the richest families in America built marble palaces, they called, with studied modesty, cottages, and spent 10 weeks a year competing to out-entertain one another. Newport was where the rain was won and lost in the open, at balls that cost more than most Americans would earn in a lifetime, and it is where 3 of these 4 women held court. Keep the geography in mind, the Fifth Avenue mansion in winter and the Newport cottage in summer, because the ballroom that crowns each of these women stands in one of those 2 places, and so does the empty ballroom that ruins her. The The first of them wanted to rule both cities in a single night. She very nearly did, and the wanting destroyed her. Chapter 3. She spent everything to reign. Cornelia Bradley Martin already had everything a woman was supposed to want, and it was not enough, because what she wanted was for the entire country to stop and look at her. She had the fortune, inherited from her father, a New York merchant who had left her something on the order of $5 or $6 million. She had the husband, Bradley Martin, from an old Albany banking family, a man content to administer his wife's money and follow her social ambitions. She had a place inside the 400 and houses on 2 continents. She had climbed to that place the way the new money always climbed, by spending, and by the one move that mattered more than any other, the dynastic marriage. Years before, she had married her only daughter, another Cornelia, at the age of 16, to the Earl of Craven, a young Englishman with an ancient title and a shortage of cash. It was the dollar princess trade in its purest form. The settlement gave the young couple an income of some $75,000 a year, bought the Earl a house in fashionable London, and paid to restore his crumbling estates. And a New York newspaper summed the whole exchange up with acid precision, that another $1 million of Yankee money had gone to swell the English treasury. In the Scottish Highlands, the Bradley Martins leased a vast estate of 65,000 acres by the shores of Loch Ness, where they entertained Russian Grand Dukes and gave near total employment to the district. Bradley Martin so loved a certain loose Highland overcoat that his London tailor named the style for the estate, so that a coat still carries a fragment of the family name into the present day. They had, in short, everything a fortune could arrange, but everything was not the top, and the top was the one thing Cornelia wanted and did not have. She wanted to reign, to be remembered not as a woman admitted to society, but as the woman who gave the greatest party the age had ever seen. In the winter of 1897, she set out to buy exactly that. The idea, as her own brother-in-law preserved it, arrived at her dinner table when he suggested a concert to relieve the hard times. The country was 3 years into the depression that had followed the financial panic of 1893, and there was real hunger in the streets of New York. Cornelia cut the suggestion down at once. A concert, she said, would only benefit foreigners. She had a far better idea. They would give a costume ball at such short notice that the guests would have no time to send to Paris for their gowns, and would be forced to spend their money instead on New York dressmakers and jewelers and florists. That, she declared, would give an impetus to trade that nothing else could. It was charity, in other words. It was a gift to the working people of the city, dressed as the most extravagant party in American history. Whether she believed that, or whether it was the story she told herself and the newspapers, no one can now say. But the theory had defenders. An economist wrote in the press that if the Bradley Martins spent $300,000 on a ball, some of that money was bound to trickle down through the different layers of society, and that it was better 40 times over to spend it on a ball than to hand it to the poor. The Gilded Age was capable of saying such things out loud, and did. The ball was held on the 10th of February at the original Waldorf Hotel, and Cornelia spared nothing. She sent out 1,200 invitations. She had the ballroom rebuilt as the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. Consider the scale of the single evening. The rooms were dressed with roughly 5,000 roses and 3,000 orchids. 100 waiters served a supper of 28 courses, terrapin and canvasback duck and foie gras, washed down with some 4,000 bottles of vintage champagne. There were 15 dressing rooms with hairdressers standing by. The cotillion did not begin until 3 in the morning, and the dancing ran until 5. Cornelia herself came dressed as Mary, Queen of Scots, in a gown of gold and pearls said to be worth more than $60,000, and she wore, draped at her throat, a set of rubies and diamonds that the jewelers claimed had once belonged to Marie Antoinette. Her husband came as a French king. Caroline Astor herself attended, blazing by report with $200,000 in diamonds. The average guest spent $11,000 on a single night's costume. The Bradley Martins spent, on the evening alone, something close to $370,000, which in the money of a later century would run well past $10 million. Now, set that against the street outside. The average American that year earned about $400 in a year. A laborer earned about $1 a day. And so a single night's party consumed, in roses and duck and champagne and rented gowns, what it would have taken thousands of working families a year each to earn, in a winter when those same families were going hungry. Cornelia had chosen her costume with a terrible aptness she could not have intended. She had dressed as a queen who lost her head. Both of the queens she invoked that night, the Scottish one she wore on her body and the French one she wore at her throat, had been destroyed by the same force, a public that decided it had seen enough. She had recreated the Palace of Versailles at the exact historical moment when Versailles had become the world's byword for what happens to rulers who feast while the people starve. She meant it as a triumph. She had built a stage for her own undoing, and she had lit it with 5,000 roses. Chapter 4. The country turned on her. She had built a palace of mirrors for one night, and by morning the whole nation was looking at her, which was precisely what she had wanted and precisely what destroyed her. The Bradley Martins had made one fatal miscalculation. They had assumed that the applause of the 400 people inside the ballroom was the only verdict that mattered. They had forgotten that outside the boarded windows there was a second audience, far larger and far angrier, and that in a democracy that second audience always gets the last word. The clergy struck first. From pulpits across the city, ministers denounced the ball as an obscenity, a feast of the rich staged in the face of the suffering poor. One preacher's line survived because it was so exact. The rich, he said, put next to nothing in the collection plate, and yet would spend thousands on Mrs. Bradley Martin's ball. J. Pierpont Morgan's own clergyman preached against it. The newspapers, which the family had actually courted by sending out press releases naming the guests and describing the costumes and listing the menu, turned that generosity into a weapon and ran the details for weeks as evidence of a class gone mad. The family began to receive threatening letters. They were mocked from the stage of the city's theatres, and the ball had been so feared as a target of public fury that the whole thing had been staged like a siege in the first place. The police commissioner, a young man named Theodore Roosevelt, had ordered hundreds of officers to ring the hotel. The outside windows had been boarded over. Plainclothes detectives had moved among the guests. The most opulent party in the history of the country had been held inside a fortress, barricaded against the very people whose money it was supposed to be helping. Here is the image to hold, because it is the whole of Cornelia Bradley Martin's story compressed into a single frame. Inside, the Hall of Mirrors, 5,000 roses, a queen in gold and pearls. Outside, a great hotel nailed shut, its windows blinded with planks, ringed by hundreds of policemen holding back a city that had come to hate the people dancing within. A palace of light, boarded up against the dark, opulence that had to hide behind wood. That is what all the money in the world could buy the Bradley Martins, and it is also exactly what it could not. It could build the room. It could not control what the country thought of the people inside it. And then came the punishment, and it was not delivered by the mob, but by the state. The city's tax assessors, in what everyone understood to be retaliation, raised the Bradley Martins' property assessment sharply, by some accounts to double what it had been. Singling the family out from all their neighbours, the Martins went to law to fight it, and lost. They had discovered the one thing their fortune could not purchase. They could not buy a friendly headline, or a forgiving pulpit, or the restraint of a tax collector, or the good opinion of a single stranger in the street. They had tried to command the public the way they commanded a ballroom, and the public had turned on them like a room emptying at once. There is a private grief under the public spectacle that the newspapers never knew. 3 years before the ball, Cornelia had buried her eldest son, a young man of 25. A mother who had lost a grown child through the most extravagant party in the history of her country within 3 years of the funeral, and told no one that the two might be connected, and perhaps they were not. But the silence is its own kind of eloquence. The woman at the center of the loudest night in New York left almost no words of her own behind, only that one recorded remark about giving an impetus to trade. So that across the whole vast affair she is heard, in her own voice, exactly once. And the family the ball drove into exile carried a darker luck with it. The daughter who had become a countess was widowed in the most uncanny way imaginable, when her husband, the Earl, a strong swimmer by every account, fell from his own yacht during the racing at Cowes and drowned in calm water, a death no one could ever quite explain. Bradley Martin died in London. Cornelia died a few years after him in England, and even the place of her death is uncertain in the record. An English house by one account, and the Scottish estate by another, as though the woman who had wanted the whole country to watch her had, in the end, slipped out of view so completely that no one was quite sure where she had gone. So they left. Not overnight, not in a single dramatic flight, but steadily, over the following 2 years, they wound down their life in New York and made their permanent home in England, where their daughter was a countess and where no clergyman preached against them. Bradley Martin, it was said, set foot in America only once more in the rest of his life. They kept the fortune. They kept the jewels and the Scottish estate and the title in the family. What they lost was subtler, and to a woman like Cornelia, far worse. They lost their standing in their own country, the reign she had spent a fortune to seize, the very thing the ball had been meant to secure. She had gambled her place in America on a single night, and the night had bankrupted her of the only wealth she truly wanted. And notice what she got to keep. Cornelia Bradley Martin fell, but she fell softly into an English exile with millions still in the bank and a coronet in the family. She lost a country and kept herself. She is the mildest fall in this film, and she is here first for a reason, because the next woman had no fortune to cushion her, no title to flee into, nothing at all beneath the reign but the reign itself. Cornelia's power was built on money and squandered on vanity. The woman who came after her built her power out of thin air, out of wit and cruelty and nerve, and ruled a whole city on it. And a throne made of nothing at all is a throne that can vanish into nothing at all. Chapter 5. She ruled with a cruel joke. Mamie Fish could barely read or write, had the smallest fortune of any of the great hostesses, and ruled Newport anyway, on nothing but the sharpest and cruelest tongue in America. She is the proof, in a single life, of how little social power had to do with money, and how completely it depended on the willingness of others to be ruled. She had no old name. She had no vast inheritance. She had a quick mind, a gift for the wounding phrase, and an instinct for spectacle. And with those alone, she made herself one of the 3 women who governed the summer capital of American society. She had been born Marion Graves Anthon, called Mamie all her life, into a respectable New York family that was not rich and not prominent, and that lost even its modest footing when her father died while she was still young. Her education was so thin that it became one of the legends attached to her, that she could barely sign her own name. This is the wound underneath everything she became. She was an outsider who had climbed into a world of people who prized breeding and learning she did not have, and she armored herself in the only way available to her. She learned that if she wounded first and wounded funniest, no one would ever get the chance to look down on the girl who had married up. She married Stuyvesant Fish, the heir to an old political name and the president of a great railroad, a steady and devoted man who was in every way her opposite. And while he ran the Illinois Central, she set out to conquer society by making it laugh and making it afraid. The reigning style when she arrived was solemn, hierarchical, and interminable. The long, formal dinner of many courses stretched across 3 hours, the whole thing presided over by Caroline Astor's grave machinery of rank. Mamie's answer to it was contempt turned into entertainment. With her collaborator, a penniless and witty social climber named Harry Lear, whom she kept beside her as a kind of court jester, she blew the old style apart. She cut the endless dinner down to 50 minutes. The courses rushed out and swept away so fast that guests learned to hold their plates down to keep eating. The champagne kept flowing to hurry the tempo. And she filled the hours she had saved with mockery staged as fun. She threw a dinner in honor of a mysterious visiting prince. And when the great moment came, the guest of honor was carried in and seated in the place of honor, and revealed to be a monkey, dressed in white tie and tails. She gave parties whose entire purpose was to make her guests ridiculous, and the cream of American society came anyway, in their hundreds, because an invitation from Mamie Fish was worth the risk of being the joke. Her weapon was her tongue, and the lines survive because they were repeated for decades, though most of them come down through a single memoir written long after her death, so they are best thought of as the legend of her voice rather than a transcript of it. She would greet her arriving guests, it was said, with a smile and the words, "Make yourselves at home, for there is no one who wishes you were there more than I do." She looked over a ballroom full of women in fresh Paris gowns and observed, "Here you all are, older faces and younger clothes." She met a guest at the door and told her, "Oh, how do you do? I had quite forgotten I asked you." It was cruelty, plainly, but it was cruelty performed as a public service, and Newport could not get enough of it. Being cut by Mrs. Fish became a kind of honor, proof that you mattered enough to be wounded. The parties grew wilder as her fame grew. There was a dinner, it was said, where the guests were asked to speak only in baby talk, and another where a small elephant was walked through the rooms, handing out peanuts, and a ball where Harry Lear impersonated the Tsar of Russia so convincingly that the whole company sank into court curtsies before they understood the joke, which earned him the mocking title of King Lear for the rest of his life. The most famous of all, the dinner of 100 dogs served at a long, low table, was in truth Harry Lear's party and not hers. And the lurid detail the newspapers added, that the dogs dined on foie gras, was pure invention that the pulpits then thundered against, so that even the scandals of this world were half theatre and half lie. She ruled from a Newport cottage she called Crossways, a great white pillared house of 40 rooms she had built in a deliberately, defiantly American style, furnished by American hands rather than shipped from Europe, and from it she staged the season's closing ball every year, the one entertainment no one who mattered could afford to miss. She would leave a dull party loudly and without apology, and if her own party began to sag, she was known to simply go to bed and leave her guests to fend for themselves. Boredom was the only sin she truly recognized, and she spent a fortune she did not really have, making sure she never had to feel it. For all the cruelty, there was a stranger and more generous side to her rule that the quips leave out. She used her position to break the rules as often as to enforce them. She invited a working actress to dine at her table as a social equal, a genuinely shocking thing to do in a world that treated the stage as barely respectable. She helped make it acceptable for a lady to dine in a public restaurant in a low-cut evening gown, a small revolution in its day. She had power, and she spent it now and then on the very people the old order would have kept out, precisely because she had once been kept out herself. It complicates the portrait, and it should, because Mamie Fish was not simply a monster of the ballroom. She was a clever, wounded, contradictory woman who had clawed her way to the top of a world that despised her origins, and who ruled it, for a while, exactly as she pleased. Which made it all the crueler that the world, in the end, remembered only the jokes. Here is the image that holds her whole reign, and the whole age with it. A monkey in white tie and tails, seated in the place of honor at the head of Mamie Fish's table, while the richest and best-born people in America bow to a prince who is an animal in a costume. It is a joke, and it is also a confession. It is the Gilded Age's own private admission that its nobility was a costume, that the whole apparatus of rank was a performance anyone could stage if they had the nerve. Mamie had seen through the game more clearly than anyone, seen that it was all just people agreeing to bow, and she made a career of forcing them to bow to a monkey to prove it. What she had not quite reckoned with was that the same clear sight applied to her own throne. If society was only a room full of people agreeing to be ruled, then her power lasted exactly as long as they agreed, and rooms empty. Chapter 6. The joke outlived its world. Performance is the most fragile power of all because it depends on an audience that agrees to keep watching, and one by one Mamie Fish's audience rose and left the room. Her reign had nothing under it but the reign itself. She had no great fortune to fall back on, no ancient name to coast on, nothing but the ongoing consent of a society that found her amusing. And in the space of a very few years, that society came apart and took her power with it, and there was nothing left underneath. The first blow was to her husband, and it came from the world of money, not the world of parties. Stuyvesant Fish had run the Illinois Central Railroad for 19 years, and under him it had grown from a line earning $12 million a year into one earning 37, its track spreading from a little over 2,000 miles to more than 5,000 across 13 states, its workforce swelling from a few thousand men into tens of thousands. But a more ruthless financier, Edward Harriman, had been quietly buying up control of the board, and in the autumn of 1906, at a special meeting, Harriman's men removed Fish from the presidency he had held for 2 decades. The stated reasons were financial, but society told a different story, and it is too fitting to leave out, though it should be taken as gossip rather than proven fact. The story was that Mamie had snubbed Harriman's wife, had cut her from a Newport tea for being too dull, and that the great man had taken his revenge on the husband for the wife's cruelty. Whether or not it was true, it captured a truth. The very weapon that had built Mamie's throne, the wounding social slight, was exactly the kind of thing that could bring a fortune down. Her power and her danger were the same edge. There is a strange, cold thread running through all the gaiety, and it belongs to Harry Lear, the jester who made half of it possible. In 1901, he had married a wealthy widow, and on their wedding night, by her own account written years afterward, he had turned to her and told her plainly that in public he would be everything a devoted husband should be, but that in private she must understand he did not love her and never could. They lived that way for 28 years, a marriage that was all performance and no feeling, the perfect private mirror of Mamie's public art, the smiling welcome that meant its opposite, the warmth that was entirely a mask. The whole glittering machine of Newport gaiety, it turns out, ran on people performing emotions they did not have, for audiences they secretly despised. It was funny, and it was hollow, and when the world that applauded it went away, there was nothing left underneath the performance but the tired and frightened people who had been performing. And then the world that had crowned her simply dissolved. In 1908, Caroline Astor died, and the old order she had embodied died with her. The federal income tax was coming. The First World War was coming. The armies of cheap servants who had made the whole spectacle possible were beginning to melt away. The great Newport cottages, built to be filled with 400 guests dancing till dawn, were about to become what a later writer would call white elephants, too vast and too costly to keep, their ballrooms shut and their chandeliers sold to dealers. Mamie had made herself the queen of a particular room in a particular world, and the world was closing. Her wit, which had been the sharpest currency in that world, was suddenly spending in a country that no longer existed. You cannot quip a railroad back into your husband's hands. You cannot joke a vanished society into reassembling in the ballroom. The lines that had ruled Newport were just lines now, funny things a woman had once said, and the audience that had made them matter had stood up and gone home. She died in 1915, of a stroke at the family estate up the Hudson, at the age of 62, far from the Newport cottage where she had reigned, as the glittering world she had ruled was already dying around her. And here is the cruelty of what survived. Mamie Fish is remembered today almost entirely for her jokes, the wit quoted in every history of the age, endlessly repeated at dinner parties by people who could not tell you a single other fact about her. The woman is gone. The insecurity that drove her, the near illiteracy she armored over, the outsider's terror of being looked down on, all of it forgotten. What is left is the act, a handful of cruel and brilliant lines, floating free of the frightened, clever woman who made them. Her whole self had been the performance, and the performance outlived its meaning and became a party trick. When Caroline Astor died and left the throne of American society empty, it was said that it took 3 women to replace her. Mamie Fish was one of them. But 3 queens ruling fragments is not one queen ruling all, and the fragments were already dissolving in their hands. To understand what Mamie inherited, and what it had once been, you have to go back to the woman who held it whole, the woman who was not merely a great hostess, but was, for a generation, the living definition of American society itself. She ruled longer and higher than any of them. And she fell furthest, not into exile and not into a quoted joke, but into the ruin of her own mind. Mamie merely became irrelevant. Caroline Astor lost the very faculty that had made her a queen, and then lost the difference between the crowded past and the empty present. Chapter 7. She decided who could exist. For an entire generation, to be admitted to American society meant, quite precisely, to be admitted to one woman's ballroom, and her name was Caroline Astor. She was not one hostess among several. She was the arbiter, the single point through which all social existence had to pass, and for nearly 30 years her approval was the difference between being a person of consequence and being no one at all. If Mamie Fish showed how little blood and money mattered to social power, Caroline Astor showed how much a single will could impose on a whole country, for as long as the country agreed to be imposed upon. Her authority rested on the oldest thing America had, which was time. She had been born Caroline Schermerhorn into the Knickerbocker aristocracy, the old Dutch colonial families who had been in New York since the 17th century, and she carried that descent like a scepter. When she married William Backhouse Astor, She added to that ancient name the single largest fortune in the country, the Astor money made from fur and, above all, from Manhattan real estate, the rents of a growing city flowing into the family coffers year after year. And here lies the great irony that sat at the center of her reign. The Astor fortune was new. It was 3 generations old, built by a German immigrant, precisely the kind of money Caroline spent her life keeping out. She simply had a longer head start than the Vanderbilts, and she treated that head start as though it were the difference between nobility and trade. She policed the border between old money and new while sitting atop one of the newest of the great fortunes, and she policed it all the more fiercely for that, because her own position depended on no one looking too closely at where the Astor millions had come from. She built her reign with Ward McAllister, the two of them a perfect division of labor. She supplied the unassailable name, the icy dignity, the sense of a queen who need never explain herself. He supplied the rules, the lists, and the vulgar genius for publicity she was far too grand to touch. The machinery they built was more elaborate than a single ball. In 1872, McAllister had organized a society of patriarchs, 25 gentlemen, each entitled to bring a fixed number of guests to a series of subscription balls. And it was through those balls, held at Delmonico's, that a newcomer was certified as fit for society or quietly turned away. In the era's own metaphor, to be admitted was to be counted among the sheep, and to be excluded was to be a goat. Caroline held her own court in winter at her Fifth Avenue mansion, and in summer at Beechwood, her cottage by the sea at Newport, whose ballroom she had specially enlarged to hold the famous 400. At the great January ball, the guests moved through rooms banked with orchids to a midnight supper of terrapin and canvasback duck and foie gras, served by footmen in green velvet, and 90 couples danced the cotillion until the small hours. Every detail was calibrated to say the same thing, that this was not a party, but a court. And at the summit of it stood her annual ball, held almost always on the 3rd Monday of January, the single most important night of the American social year. To be invited was to exist. Guests were received by Mrs. Astor standing beneath a life-sized portrait of herself, in the manner of a monarch receiving at court, dressed in a gown of dark velvet and armoured, quite literally, in diamonds. She wore a stomacher of diamonds across her bodice, a diamond tiara, diamond stars set in her dark hair, ropes of diamonds at her throat, and, it was said, a great spray of diamonds across her back, so heavy and so wide that it prevented her from leaning back in her chair. The jewels enforced the posture of a queen. She could not slouch if she tried. The most evocative of all her jewels was the one that connects her, across a century, to Cornelia Bradley Martin in her Marie Antoinette rubies, because Caroline Astor, too, was said to wear diamonds that had once belonged to the doomed French queen. Every careful account hedges the claim, calls it said to have belonged, marks it as rumour. It almost certainly was rumour, one of the stories the Gilded Age loved to tell about itself. But the rumour is worth more than the fact, because of what it reveals. The women who ruled American society reached, again and again, for the jewels of Marie Antoinette, for the image of the most glamorous queen who ever lived, and forgot, every time, how that queen had ended. They wanted the diamonds. They did not want to remember the tumbril. Caroline Astor, receiving beneath her own portrait in the dead queen's diamonds, was the very definition of a reign that believed itself eternal. It was not. It was already, though she could not yet see it, under siege. Chapter 8. A rival made her bow. The woman who had spent her whole life deciding who could enter was, one spring, forced by her own rules to go and beg entrance from the new money she despised. It is the hinge on which Caroline Astor's story turns, and it is one of the great set pieces of the age. And the astonishing thing is that she was defeated not by a scandal or a catastrophe, but by simple arithmetic. The new fortunes were growing faster than the old ones, and there were more of them every year, and no single ballroom, however exclusive, could hold back a rising sea forever. The particular wave that broke over Caroline Astor had a name, and the name was Alva Vanderbilt. Alva had married into the Vanderbilt Railroad fortune, money so new and so enormous that it made even the Astors look modest, and she had run headlong into Caroline's refusal to recognize her. To Mrs. Astor, the Vanderbilts were mechanics who had gotten rich, not people one received. So Alva did what the new money always did in this war. She built something bigger. In 1883, she completed a French chateau on Fifth Avenue at a cost of some $3 million, and she announced a costume ball to open it that would be the most magnificent the city had ever seen. Consider the scale, because scale was the weapon. The ball cost around $250,000. It drew nearly 1,200 guests. There was $65,000 of champagne and $11,000 of flowers, and the dancing went on until the sun came up. Set that single evening beside Caroline Astor's sacred 400, and the whole shift of the age is visible in one comparison. The old queen ruled 400 people in a drawing room. The new one entertained 3 times that number in a palace, and did it to announce her arrival. And into this spectacle, Alva planted a single, exquisite trap. The story, as it has come down, is too perfect to be entirely true, and the museums that keep it now flag it honestly as part legend. But the heart of it is real. Caroline Astor's daughter, young Carrie, had been rehearsing for weeks with her friends to dance a special quadrille at the great ball, dreaming of it, and when the invitations went out, hers did not come. Alva let it be known, with wounding courtesy, that she could not possibly invite Miss Astor, because Mrs. Astor had never called at the Vanderbilt house, had never left her card, had never formally recognized that the Vanderbilts existed at all. And so Caroline Astor was caught in the machinery of her own making, to let her daughter's heart break, or to bend. She bent. She ordered her carriage, drove to the Vanderbilt chateau, and left her card. The next day, the invitation arrived. Whether or not every detail of the quadrille is true, the central act is documented, and it is devastating. The arbiter of exclusion, the woman who had built her entire life on the power to refuse, was forced by her own rules to seek admittance from the very people she had refused. The wall she had guarded for a generation came down, and she took it down herself, with her own hand, on a calling card. After that, the erosion never stopped. She lost the war over the opera the same way, abandoning the exclusive old Academy of Music, with its handful of boxes reserved for the old families, when the new money simply built the far grander Metropolitan Opera House and filled it with their own. There was a second humiliation, and it came from inside her own family, and it built a landmark that stands to this day. Caroline had claimed for herself the title of the Mrs. Astor, the single definite article implying that among all the women who bore the name, there was only one who counted. Her nephew disagreed, insisting the title belonged to his own wife, and when he lost the social argument, he took a spectacular architectural revenge. He tore down his mansion, which stood beside Caroline's, and in its place raised a great 13-story hotel, deliberately flooding her exclusive block with the traffic and the strangers she had spent her life keeping out. Rather than live beside it, Caroline and her son moved further up Fifth Avenue, and her son answered the insult in kind by building an even taller hotel on their old site. The two rival hotels were later joined together, with a corridor that could be sealed off again if the family feud reignited, into a single establishment that took both their names and became the most famous hotel in the world, the Waldorf Astoria. The family war over who was the true queen had built, out of pure spite, a monument that would outlast every person who ever fought in it. She is said to have looked at the whole changing world and accepted it, at last, in a line that captures the surrender, that there was no longer any right to exclude those whom the growth of the country had brought forward, that the time had come for the Vanderbilts. The words may be reconstructed rather than exact, but they are true to what happened. The gate was open. And once it was open, the thing on the other side was not a few new families to be absorbed. It was a flood. Society got larger and richer and newer every year, too large for any one drawing room to gate, and Caroline Astor's power, which had been the power to keep the number small, drained away in proportion as the number grew. She built a new mansion with a ballroom that could hold 1,200, 3 times the sacred 400, and the very size of it was the confession. A society that needs a room for 1,200 is a society no longer ruled by anyone. She had spent her life as the keeper of a small and perfect number, and she lived to watch the number become meaningless, and herself along with it. The dethroning was slow, and it was nearly complete, when her own mind began to give way and carried her back into the vanished past for good. Chapter 9. She greeted the long dead. In the end, the Queen of the 400 came down her great staircase in full diamonds to receive a ballroom of guests, and every one of them was dead. It is the most haunting image in this entire history, and it needs to be told with care, because the truth of it is both sadder and stranger than the legend, and the sadness and the strangeness are the same thing. The last years were a long withdrawal. The world she had ruled had moved on to younger, faster women, and the machinery of her reign had rusted around her. Ward McAllister, the man who had built the throne with her, had destroyed himself years before by publishing a gossiping memoir that traded on his intimacy with the great families, and society, appalled, had cast him out. He died alone at his club, in social disgrace, the architect of the 400 exiled from it. Her husband, who had never cared for society and had spent his life on his yacht and at the races and in the company of other women, was long dead. Her friends were dying. The great house on Fifth Avenue grew quiet, and then, in 1908, Caroline Astor suffered a breakdown and a fall on the marble staircase of her own mansion. Her servants found her on the floor, her white hair matted with blood. The wounds healed. Her mind did not. Into the silence of the great empty house, dementia came, and it did what dementia does. It carried her back to the only time that had ever mattered to her, and it would not let her leave. Here is what her biographer documents, and it is precise, and it is terrible. In her last months, she planned balls that would never be held. She discussed the guest lists for parties that no one would attend, going over the names with her butler, deciding who would be invited to entertainments that existed nowhere but in her failing mind. She received, as the phrase goes, her silent, empty house. In one account, she came to believe, in her confusion, that she was expecting a child, and had a nursery made ready in the great house for a baby that would never be born. The last cruel trick of a mind that had lost its hold on time. And out of that documented core, the legend hardened into its most famous form, the image that everyone now repeats, of the old queen descending her staircase in full diamonds to greet, by name, the friends of her great years, friends who had been in their graves for a decade. The strict record does not confirm that she called the dead by name. What the record confirms is worse in its way, because it is real. A woman whose entire self had been the ball went on giving the ball, alone, in an empty house, to a society that no longer existed until she died. And it must be said honestly, because this channel does not trade in cheap ghosts, that there is nothing supernatural required to explain any of it. What Caroline Astor suffered has a name, and the name is dementia. The planning of events that will never happen, the retreat into a vivid past, the expectation of people long gone. These are the ordinary and heartbreaking features of a mind coming apart, documented in countless patients who were never queens of anything. There was no curse on the house. There was an old woman with a failing brain and a lifetime of one single obsession, and the two together produced the image of a haunting. But leave the verdict where it belongs, which is open. Whether the guests she received were ghosts in the room or only ghosts in her mind, the picture is the same. And it is the exact and literal statement of everything this film is about. When your whole self is the ballroom and the ballroom empties, you do not stop giving the ball. You give it to the dead. She died in the autumn of 1908 at 78. Her personal estate was reported at a strikingly modest figure, a little over $1.5 million, because the great Astor fortune had always been in the land, and the land passed down the male line, away from her. She had ruled American society more completely than any woman before or since, and she went into the ground with a fraction of the family's wealth and a mind that had spent its last year entertaining the dead. 4 years later, her only son would close the public chapter of the Astor reign in the century's most famous disaster. John Jacob Astor IV had scandalized even his mother's world by divorcing his first wife, and then, at the age of 47, marrying a girl of 18, and he had taken his young bride abroad to let the outrage cool. They came home aboard the Titanic. He drowned when she went down in the spring of 1912, the richest man on the ship, and his body was pulled from the North Atlantic days afterward. The son of the Queen of the 400 went to the bottom of the sea with more money than anyone else aboard, and it saved him no more than his mother's diamonds had saved her. But Caroline Astor was, by then, already gone into her empty ballroom. She had been dethroned, and then she had lost her mind, and the losing of the mind was almost a mercy, because it took her back to the only place she had ever wanted to be. The last woman in this film would be denied even that. She began with everything the others had fought for, the money and the house and the throne, and it bought her only the largest empty ballroom in America, and a mind that would not let her rest inside it. Chapter 10. Silver could not buy control. Tessie Oelrichs had one of the greatest fortunes in America, and she spent her entire life in a war for control that she was always, quietly, losing. If the others show what happens when social power is built on vanity, or on wit, or on an ancient name, Tessie shows the cruelest lesson of all, which is that even the biggest fortune in the room buys you nothing that finally matters. She could command anything money could touch. She could command nothing that mattered, and she knew it, and the knowing drove her to the edge of madness long before the end. The money was silver, and it came out of the ground in Nevada. Her father, James Fair, was one of the so-called Bonanza Kings, an Irish immigrant who had struck the richest vein of the Comstock Lode, the greatest silver strike in American history, and turned it into a fortune reckoned at $45 or $50 million, enough that a single man held wealth equal to a measurable slice of the whole national economy. He became a United States Senator on the strength of it. But he was also, by wide agreement, a drunk and a serial adulterer, nicknamed Slippery Jim. And here is the wound at the root of Tessie's life. When she was about 12 years old, Her mother sued her father for divorce on the grounds of habitual adultery, and won. And the whole squalid business of his mistresses and his drinking was dragged through the newspapers while he sat in the Senate. The fortune that would crown Tessie a queen came to her wrapped in public shame. Her family had money beyond counting and no dignity at all, and the little girl who watched her parents' marriage explode in the papers grew into a woman with a desperate, lifelong need to make one world, at least, perfectly clean and perfectly controlled. The shadows did not stop with her parents. Both of her brothers came to bad ends, one dead young by his own hand, as some told it, the other disinherited by their father and killed in a motorcar crash in France. Her sister, Virginia, called Birdie, Tessie steered into a marriage with a Vanderbilt, binding the silver money to the greatest of the railroad names. And when Tessie herself married, her father gave her $1 million as a wedding gift and then refused to attend the wedding, staying uninvited in his hotel room while his daughter was married in the grandest ceremony San Francisco had ever seen. It was the pattern of her whole childhood in a single day. The money given freely, the presents and the love withheld entirely. She married Hermann Oelrichs, a socially impeccable but comparatively modest man, the American agent for a great German shipping line, and the money in the marriage and the power it bought were hers alone. Even her devotion to her father's memory turned on the same axis of money standing in for feeling. After his death, Tessie and her sister built a great hotel in San Francisco and named it for him, a marble monument to the very man who had shamed them in the newspapers and snubbed them at the altar, as though a building could settle a debt of love that a living father had never paid. It is a very Gilded Age kind of grief, to answer an absence of affection with an act of construction, to build where you cannot embrace. She would do it again, on a grander and more personal scale, with the White Palace she raised at Newport. The fair women had learned, from the cradle, that when the heart failed you, you spent, and that a thing you built could stand in the world's eye for a love you had never been given. And she poured it into the thing that would be her monument and her haunting, a house. Between 1899 and 1902, she had the architect Stanford White build her Rosecliff on the cliffs at Newport, modelled on a palace at Versailles, a house of gleaming white terracotta at a cost of some $2.5 million. At its heart, she placed a ballroom 40 feet deep and 80 feet wide, with ceilings 22 feet high, the largest ballroom in all of Newport. She was so impatient to begin entertaining that she moved into the unfinished house 2 years early and gave a dinner for 112 guests among the bare walls, screening the raw plaster with palms and ferns. When it was finished, it was a wonder. Its entrance hall held a great curving staircase in the shape of a heart, and its rooms opened one into another toward that vast white and gold ballroom. Into it, she poured entertainments to match, a whole circus brought up by train from New York for a single party, and on one evening, the magician Harry Houdini performing for her guests. Everything about the house said permanence, said dynasty, said that the silver camp girl had arrived and would never be dislodged. It was the most emphatic statement of belonging that money could build, and she had built it, without quite knowing, as the stage for the loneliest ending of them all. Because inside that gleaming reign lived a woman at war with disorder. Among the 3 queens of Newport, where one was known for extravagance and one for wit, Tessie was known as the drill sergeant, the martinet, the one who ran the machine. Her husband's own niece said she was addicted to society as if it were a business, and her need for control had a strange, revealing shape. She was obsessed with cleanliness. She made her own bed every day. She would not sleep in any sheets but her own, and carried her own bed with her when she travelled abroad. She inspected the whole of Rosecliff every morning, and if a marble floor did not meet her standard, she would take up a mop and a pail herself, on her knees, and scrub it. This was a woman worth tens of millions of dollars, who could have commanded an army of servants to do anything she asked, scrubbing her own floors at dawn. And she told anyone who would listen exactly what it meant to her. When she died, she said, she wished to be buried with a cake of soap in one hand and a scrubbing brush in the other. They were, she said, her symbols. She was more right than she knew. The scrubbing was the one thing in her whole vast life she could actually control, and she clung to it, and in the end it was nearly all she had left. Chapter 11. She scrubbed the marble alone. At the very height of her reign, she conjured a fleet of ghostly white ships out of the sea for a single night's ball, and she could not keep her own husband inside the house. The gap between those two facts is the whole of Tessie Oelrichs, the woman who could summon anything except the things she wanted, and it is worth standing inside the gap for a moment, because it is where she lived. The ball was the White Ball, given at Rosecliff in the summer of 1904, and it was the purest expression of her genius for control turned into spectacle. Everything was white. White hydrangeas and orchids and lilies by the thousand. White swans floating on the fountain. The guests dressed in white, some with their hair powdered white to match. 400 of them danced from 10 at night until dawn, at a cost of some $30,000 for the single evening, and the women were sent home with lace favours from Paris, and the men with English pipes in white cases. And out in the dark water beyond the lawn, Tessie had arranged her masterpiece. She had a fleet of ships lit up offshore, so that the guests looked out from the ballroom and saw a squadron riding at anchor in the night, a whole navy conjured for their pleasure. In the legend, they were a dozen full-sized vessels, ghostly white hulls glowing on the Black Sea. In the sober truth, they were probably small boats hung with lights, arranged to give the illusion of a distant fleet. No photographs were allowed, and none survive, so the fleet exists now only in the telling, which is fitting, because it was always an illusion. She had made ships appear on the sea by force of will and money, phantom ships, there and not there. She did not yet know that she was rehearsing. The phantom fleet on the water was the first draft of the phantom guests she would one day seat in her ballroom. Behind the white spectacle, the private world was already cracked. Her marriage had long been a performance over an emptiness. She and Herman had lived essentially apart for years, with, as one account puts it flatly, no devotion between them. And then, in 1906, the emptiness became a wound that would not close. Herman died at sea, aboard a great liner in the middle of the Atlantic, and he died unreconciled to her. And worse, he had made a will that left his estate to his brother rather than to his wife, on the assumption, or the excuse, that she had money enough of her own. She had to go to law against a dead husband to claim a share, and settled at last for half. In a single year, she had been abandoned, widowed, and cut from the will. 3 wounds delivered by the same man, and the marriage that had been a public triumph was exposed as a private desolation. The one relationship a fortune cannot buy had failed her completely, and around her, the world that had made Rosecliff meaningful was ending. Hold the numbers of that vanishing world a moment, because they are the measure of what was lost. Her father's silver had been reckoned at $45 million, a single man holding a slice of the whole nation's wealth. Rosecliff had cost $2.5 million to build. The White Ball had burned $30,000 in a single night. 400 guests had once danced beneath its 22-foot ceilings until the sun came up. And now the income tax was arriving, and the war, and the servants were leaving for better wages in the factories and the cities, and one by one the great cottages were being shuttered and stripped, their contents sold to dealers, their ballrooms locked and dark. The most expensive social machine ever built in America was running down, and the season that had filled her enormous ballroom was thinning year by year, and the woman who had built the largest engine of it all was being left alone inside it. So she turned inward, to the one thing she had always been able to command, the cleanliness of a floor. The inspections grew more obsessive. The scrubbing grew more constant. Picture the largest ballroom in Newport, built to hold 400 dancers under those soaring ceilings, and in the middle of its gleaming marble, alone, on her knees, the richest hostess of them all, scrubbing a floor that no guest was any longer coming to cross. That is the true image, the well-attested one, and it is almost unbearable. All the silver of the Comstock lode, and it had bought her a mop. She had spent her life making one perfect, spotless, controllable world, and the world had shrunk, in the end, to the exact size of the patch of marble under her hands. Chapter 12. She hosted a party of ghosts. In her last years, the story goes, Tessie Oelrichs dressed for a ball every evening and went down into the largest ballroom in Newport to greet and to seat the guests who were not there. It is the eerie climax of this whole history, the deepest point of the fall, and it must be told with the honesty this channel owes its subjects, because the most famous image of Tessie's ending is also the least documented, and the honesty is what makes it land. Here is what is well attested, and it is disturbing enough on its own. Tessie's obsession with cleanliness and control, lifelong, deepened in her final years into something that consumed her. The compulsive scrubbing, the endless inspections, the retreat into a private ritual of order, all of this is recorded across the accounts of those who knew her. And here is what is repeated everywhere but rests on far thinner evidence, on society recollection, rather than any medical or contemporary record, so that it should be told as the legend it is, and not as certified fact. It is said that in the end she lost her mind, and that she wandered the empty Rosecliff, welcoming and seating imaginary guests, holding balls for a company that did not exist, greeting a society that had died or scattered in the ballroom she had built to be the fullest room in America. The house museum that keeps her memory today does not put the story in its own careful biography of her, but it has been told and retold for a century, because it is too true to the shape of her life to let go of, and because it rhymes exactly with the ending of the other queen in this film. Two women who rose highest on pure social power, Caroline Astor and Tessie Oelrichs, both came to rest in the same impossible image, alone in a gilded ballroom, receiving the dead. And as with Caroline, the honest hand leaves the verdict open, because the honest verdict is the most haunting one available. There is no need to reach for a curse or a ghost. What the accounts describe, the repetition, the retreat into a vanished social world, the mistaking of an empty room for a full one, is consistent with a mind failing in old age, perhaps a dementia, perhaps deepened by grief and isolation, and the lifelong compulsions that had always run just beneath her control. No diagnosis was ever written down. The vivid scenes are legend. But whether Tessie Oelrichs truly seated phantom guests in that ballroom, or whether the story only grew up around a woman who scrubbed her marble alone and spoke to no one, the meaning does not change. And now, for one moment, imagine it is you. Imagine you have spent your whole life building one perfect room and filling it with the most brilliant company in the world, and being told that you are the one who decides who may enter. Imagine that every ounce of who you are has been poured into that single power, the power to gather the living and arrange them and be seen at the center of them. And then imagine the night you understand that no one is coming, and that no one will ever come again, and that you go down the staircase anyway, dressed and ready, into the largest and most beautiful empty room in America. Because the alternative is to admit that the room and the rain and the whole of the self you built upon them were never anything more solid than a party other people had once agreed to attend. That is the horror at the bottom of this story, and it is not a ghost. It is the thing the ghost stands for. She died at Rosecliff in the autumn of 1926, at the age of 55, younger than any of the others, and her funeral was held in the house itself, in a room hung with blue and gold. And then came the final, brutal arithmetic, the number that says everything. The house had cost $2.5 million to build. When her son sold it, in the early 1940s, it went for $21,000. The largest ballroom in Newport, the throne room of a silver queen, changed hands for less than 1 part in 100 of what it had cost to raise. A palace sold for the price of a modest house, because the world that had given it meaning was gone, and no one wanted a marble monument to a dead reign. All that silver had bought the largest ballroom in America. It could not, in the end, put a single living guest inside it. She had begun with everything the others had spent their lives chasing, and it left her alone on her knees on a marble floor, hosting a party of ghosts. Chapter 13. The rooms outlived the women. Rosecliff is a museum now. The great ballroom where Tessie Oelrichs is said to have greeted her phantom guests is open to visitors who pay for a ticket, and it has stood in, on film, for the mansion of Jay Gatsby, that other American who threw enormous parties into an emptiness and was never really seen by any of the people who came. The Waldorf, where Cornelia Bradley Martin recreated Versailles and lost her country, gave its name to a hotel that became a byword for luxury the world over, a brand that outlived every human being who ever fought over it. The 400, Caroline Astor's sacred number, survives as a phrase, a bit of shorthand for any closed and gilded elite, long after the last person who could have named its members turned to dust. The rooms survived. The names on the doors survived. Only the women were erased. Look at what each of them was left with. Cornelia Bradley Martin, who spent a fortune to rule and was driven into exile for it, is remembered, if at all, as the woman who threw the party that ended an age, a cautionary tale, a costume, and a scandal. Mamie Fish, who ruled all of Newport on the sharpest tongue in America, is a handful of cruel and brilliant lines, quoted by people who could not tell you she existed. Caroline Astor, who for a generation decided who was permitted to be a person, is an old woman coming down a staircase in diamonds to greet the dead. And Tessie Oelrichs, who commanded one of the great fortunes of the century, is a figure alone on her knees on a marble floor, scrubbing, or a shape moving through an empty ballroom, seating guests who are not there. 4 queens, and this is the sum of what 4 reigns came to. There is one figure who moves through all of it, connecting the stories like a thread pulled through cloth, and her name is Alva Vanderbilt. She was the rival who forced Caroline Astor to bow, and she was one of the 3 women who inherited the throne when Caroline died, ruling Newport in her years beside Mamie Fish and Tessie Oelrichs. The same woman who broke the old queen became a peer of the new ones, and even she, with all her will and all her Vanderbilt millions, could not hold the world together, and ended by turning her back on society altogether to march in the streets for the vote. If the strongest of them could not keep it, none of them ever could. And it is worth remembering that all of this unfolded in the great age of the séance, when fashionable people gathered in darkened rooms to call up the dead and whispered that certain fortunes and certain jewels were cursed. Against that backdrop, the two empty ballrooms take on their full and terrible meaning. The society that lived for the ball ended in two of its greatest queens by giving the ball to the dead, and it could never quite decide whether that was an illness or a haunting, because in this world, the two had always been very nearly the same thing. It is worth saying plainly what this history has been about, because the costume can hide it. It is a story about power, and about the one kind of power that cannot be kept, the power that lives only in other people's minds and vanishes the moment they look away. It is a story about the gap between the public grandeur and the private ruin, between the 5,000 roses and the boarded window, between the white ball and the woman scrubbing the floor alone. And it is finally a story about the oldest fear there is, older than the Gilded Age and outliving it, the fear of being someone and then being no one, of ruling the room and then watching it empty, of building your whole self out of the applause of a crowd that will, one day, without warning and without apology, simply stand up and leave. These women knew a truth the men counting their millions never learned. In America, the real currency was never money. It was recognition, being seen, being received, being allowed to exist. They spent their lives amassing it, and every one of them discovered that it could not be locked away, could not be defended, could not be bought back once it was gone. Go back, at the last, to where it began, to Cornelia Bradley Martin standing in her Hall of Mirrors on that February night in 1897, dressed as a queen who lost her head, the roses banked to the ceiling, the champagne poured, the whole of society bowing around her, and outside the boarded windows, a country turning cold. She thought she was being crowned. She was watching the beginning of the end, of her reign and of the age itself, reflected back at her 1,000 times in the mirrored walls of a room that could only see itself. Every one of these women stood, at her height, in a room like that, a room that told her she was the center of the world, and every one of them lived to learn what the room really was. A throne is only the applause of a crowd, and a ballroom, when the crowd is gone, is just a large and beautiful place to be alone. Tessie Oelrichs asked to be buried with a cake of soap in one hand and a scrubbing brush in the other, because they were, she said, her symbols. In the end, they were the symbols of all four of them, the tools of the one small thing a queen could still control, when the great thing, the reign, the recognition, the throne of other people's regard, had slipped out of her hands and left her alone in the largest and emptiest room she had ever built. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the true story hiding underneath the glamour, subscribe and stay with me, because there are more of these women and more of these rooms than the histories ever told. And tell me, in the comments, which of these four endings stayed with you the most, and whether you think any of them, had she ruled differently, could have kept the throne. I read everyone, and I think about them long after the video ends.